Thank you, Tom.
Hi,
Hello.
everyone. Yeah, Bob and I are really excited to be here. I thought as a way of introducing Bob tonight, so I've had the experience of getting to know Bob for the last 10 years or so, and most recently, we've gotten to teach together in one of a workshop that we hosted together for 6 days in October. And I thought a fun way to introduce him to you, so you get a taste of him pretty quickly, was just to read a few of the quotes that people said about him, because they were pretty fun. The first one is, great human and professor. His laugh is infectious.
Where'd you get this stuff?
This is from the feedback that we got
the teaching
from our
evaluations.
workshop.
Don't give him the bad stuff. That's good.
There's
always bad stuff.
Someone said, the way that Bob teaches is amazing. He's funny and he's really easy to learn from. And somebody asked, can Bob start a podcast? So I think tonight we'll get a little...
We do have a podcast, actually. The Friction podcast.
That's true. And tonight it'll feel a little bit like a podcast here, I think, but more intimate. And I just love all those things. I got to be first a student of Bob's, and I think he does such a great job of making things feel easy to learn, even when they're really complex. So I wanted to start off by asking Bob just to tell us a little bit about his work to date, because as you know, tonight we will dig in more to his work and research on friction. But he's an organizational psychologist in research and training. So could you tell us a little bit about what got you to here, really quickly?
You never know what's going to happen in life. And so I always advise Stanford students, and Catherine's a classic person. She was a Stanford undergraduate and then got a PhD in communications and now teaches innovation. So who knows what's going to happen. So I was a psychology major for 11 years at Berkeley and then at the University of Michigan. And then I became an engineering professor. So I'm a tenured engineering professor. I've never had an engineering class in my life, and I couldn't pass one. So God knows. So my work as an organizational psychologist, I tend to try to bring together sort of the human emotional part with the organizational structure, strategy, innovation. And if I would say the main areas that I've done research on are, my dissertation was on dying organizations in Michigan. So the process by which you take an organization apart. I probably got tenure on research on the expression of emotion in organizational life. The fact that many of us in the jobs that we have were kind of required to express certain emotions and suppress others. It's called emotional labor. And then I met a guy named David Kelly in the mid-90s. David Kelly is the founder of IDEO and the D.school. And then I got sort of the innovation design thinking disease, and eventually turned to doing more sort of applied stuff on leadership, innovation. I'm most well known for 2 books on assholes, for better or worse. And more recently with my colleague Huggy Rao and I, we've been doing stuff on scaling and then the friction stuff we're doing now. I think that's probably enough about my 45-year research career, I guess it is.
Yeah, thanks. So you know a little bit about us now. I met Bob when I was taking a class from him, I think 10 years ago, in a couple of months, actually. I was reflecting as I was getting ready for this and thinking it was the moment probably most in my professional and academic career, kind of the weeks and months where my direction changed the most out of my, my experience so far, my career direction. And since then, I've gotten to teach alongside of Bob and continue to learn, of course, alongside of him as well. And we thought we would get to know the crowd a little bit. We want to ask some of the questions that are relevant to the crowd, and of course, we'll turn it over for Q&A eventually. But if you are, let's see, why don't we start with kind of a corporate position?
Okay.
If you are in a larger company, a corporate position, would you just raise your hand?
Wow.
Okay. Yeah, so maybe
that's great.
40% of us. Okay, let's see. What if you're in a smaller organization, you're in a startup, maybe you work for yourself? Can we see some hands around that? Yeah, nice. Silicon Valley. Okay, what about maybe a learning organization or a
nonprofit.
university?
Who's in a nonprofit?
Let's do nonprofit
My wife's
first.
here. She's in a nonprofit, so I have to make sure my wife raises her hand.
Yeah. What about a university or a school? Any students in the crowd?
Wow.
Awesome.
Well, you brought a bunch of people from Omaha.
Yeah, I'm a Nebraskan at heart, yeah. A few fun friends and colleagues in the crowd. Okay, that's great. We'll try to use questions that leverage the diversity of this room. It seems like we've got a lot of diverse perspectives tonight. Okay, so as you know, or you should get up and leave, you are here for a chat about friction. And Bob has been, out of many chapters in his work and life, has been focusing on this topic kind of more recently.
4 or 5 years, and my co-conspirator, Hayagriva Rao from the Stanford Business School, he gets at least half the blame, even though he's not here. So I have somebody I'm working with on this who's a wonderful co-author.
So can you tell us when you first started thinking about this work, or when you first were intrigued by it, what prompted you to want to learn and eventually practice so much in this space?
In 2014, Huggy and I published a book called Scaling Up Excellence, which is about how to essentially take, when you've got a little bit of goodness, to spread it further in an organization without screwing up what you're trying to spread or without screwing up the organization. So it could be scaling Google or something that Catherine and I have been involved in, maybe ad nauseum, which is scaling design thinking. In the last decade, the number of organizations we've worked with who have struggled to spread design thinking and messed it up a lot of time is just amazing. So in the process of that, we kept noticing, Huggy and I kept noticing 2 things. One is that in some organizations, in particular in programs, that when they were little, it would be easy to get things done, but then as they got bigger and bigger and bigger, it got harder to get those exact same things done. So that was one impetus for it. The other impetus, which is more personal, and to tell tales out of school, literally in this case. So I've been at Stanford for 37 years, and every year it has gotten harder to get the exact same things done. To give you some straight math, so the School of Engineering, which I've been in forever, when I first got there, we had 1 person in the entire school who did money, 1. And now every unit, even the design school that we're part of, they have a 3-person finance team. It's impossible to get anything done. And I was talking to, and I won't use her name even though she said I could, there's a woman I know who has raised not millions, maybe billions of dollars for Stanford. And she's been there 25 years. And what she said is when she first got there, she spent 100% of her time doing fundraising. Now she spends 50% of her time on compliance, 50% of her time on fundraising. So just to sort of give you a little bit of dirt, this notion that yes, sometimes things should be hard to get done, but that's what Huggy and I got interested in is, well, what are the causes of this dysfunctional friction? What are some of the cures? Because there are some cures. And then finally, when is friction good? Because some things should be hard to get done. So that's what we've been futzing around with for 5 years, and we're hoping to steal some answers from you tonight. So that's why I'm looking forward to the Q&A. That's one reason that I'm doing a lot of talks this week on this topic.
Can you break down what friction is for us? I know we talk about it, we've mentioned it already a few times tonight, but can you give us just some tangible examples that might qualify as friction in maybe lives of people here or people that you've met?
Well, just as an example, for us, it's when you're trying to do something that should be easy. It's everything from getting budget approval to getting approval for your travel expenses to getting your computer fixed when it breaks. And so in that process, if you start having friction, oh, this is hard, we sort of have a hierarchy. It's friction, oh, this is harder to do than it should be. Then you start feeling helpless and start getting more and more upset, and finally you just give up. So that's sort of the hierarchy that we talk about, and there's a lot of different causes of friction. The classic one, if you look at corporate life, are emails and meetings. There's a whole bunch of other kinds of friction. Silos are another sort of cause of friction, but that's the kind of stuff that we think of when we think about destructive friction.
So you mentioned a story already that was more from your personal perspective, but as you look at the different organizations you've studied and stories or examples of an incredible amount of friction, can you share maybe a story that comes to mind about a team or an organization that was really, it's not bad intended. Sometimes it happens with good intentions.
Well, actually, I'll give something that's specific because unfortunately, I spent a little time in the Stanford hospital after I had a bike crash this summer. And so one of our mottos is that the road to hell with friction is paved by good intentions. So have any of you had this experience where you go and you talk to the healthcare provider and they actually don't look you in the eye? They just look at the electronic medical records? Have you had this experience? And if you look at the sort of the basis of electronic medical records, it's actually really a good thing in theory, because what's happening is they want to keep the records and they want it to be accurate and they want to get the drug interactions and everything. But what's happening is more and more, and you talk to physicians and nurses, they all complain about this, that in the end they spend more time doing the electronic medical records than actually giving you patient care. And so that would be an example of sort of the road to hell is paved by good intentions. Another example, does anybody here been in an organization where they have 360-degree evaluations? So the concept of 360-degree evaluations is great because they like everybody around you sort of analyzes what's happened and you get complete feedback. So Deloitte, just about 4 or 5 years ago, figured out that remember Deloitte bills by the hour, they're a consulting firm, that they were spending 2 million hours a year doing 360-degree evaluations, and they sort of trimmed it back. So that's some of the bad stories. And then I'll tell you kind of a good story.
Yeah,
if you want a good story.
One maybe
so,
is where friction was removed.
Dropbox, who knows Dropbox? Yeah, we all know Dropbox. So Dropbox was the CEO, co-founder, Drew Houston. I was thinking of actually Phil's Coffee. I met the CEO of Phil's Coffee today, even though we have the competitor here. Phil's, as
he
we know,
didn't drink any. It was okay, right? You didn't have anything to drink there, surely.
At Phil's?
Just drank Blue bottle.
No, I drank Phil's because I got a free cup of coffee from the CEO. You would drink it too. So anyway, what happened is one of my students, Rebecca Hines, who's now a PhD student at Stanford, so she goes to work there and she finds out about this thing called Armageddon. So here's what happened. It's 2013, and Drew Houston and his head of IT figure out 3 things. One is that people are spending more time in meetings. 2, the meetings are getting bigger. And 3, they're missing ship dates. So this is friction, because they're spending all this time in meetings. So what they do is they go into everybody's calendar, and this was announced in an email that said, our Armageddon has landed. They removed all standing meetings, except for ones with customers from everybody's calendar. And people weren't allowed to put in a new meeting for 2 weeks. So literally, it's just like your whole calendar was expunged, and they came up with all these great things like, and this is don't start a meeting if an email will do. But my favorite one was, if you are at a meeting and the meeting sucks, you're supposed to leave. And if at Stanford, anybody works at Stanford, but we have so many horrible meetings. That whenever I'm in a bad meeting, like I always say to myself, gee, I wonder whether I can leave. And there is a footnote to this, though, which is something that Drew Houston, this happened in 2013, and then we wrote it up in 2015, and I saw him at a party just last summer, and I asked him how it was going. He said it's worse than ever. It's like the lawn. You've got to mow it every week, or you have a problem. So that's one of our mottos, is that friction reduction is sort of a way of life. It's something you've always got to kind of be thinking about.
So 2 thoughts come to mind. One is there's examples of friction where it's adding, it's basically growing, and it's creating a bad environment. There are other examples where people have really actively worked to pull it back, doing a good job of managing it. You've mentioned to me something that stuck in my mind as places where friction is weaponized. It's kind of a strong word, but you were sharing some examples the other day. We kind of have the good, the bad, maybe an ugly example of where is friction really weaponized?
Well, to me, friction is weaponized. So I'll just give you an example. So if anybody subscribes to the Financial Times, which is, I think, a great newspaper, try ending your subscription. So you, and this is the same thing with try ending a gym subscription. You ever tried to? So the concept is it's really easy to do it online. So the Financial Times, you cannot actually end your subscription online. So you have to call somebody. So I called, and I realized, because and this is maybe a narcissism problem for me, I had an article published and I got all excited and bought the most expensive subscription and forgot about it. It's like $60, $70 a month. And so finally I figured out I have to call them after about half an hour, and literally I told the guy at the beginning of the phone call, so I just want to end my subscription. Please don't try to upsell me or downsell me. he had to read the whole script. We had to go through like 25 minutes. So what about $40 a month? What about $30 a month? What about $5 a month? And I just kept saying, so you know exactly what I'm talking about. But to me, that's weaponizing friction. Yeah. Another thing, by the way, I hate to bring up politics, and we don't want to get too political, but if you look at some of the stuff that's happening with, the old Soviet Union and the Russians, one of the strategies that the Russians were famous for with other competitors, and this goes way back because I've been reading this stuff about friction, is what they do is they create noise and confusion among their enemies so nobody can figure out what's exactly going on. And at least I'm not really a conspiracy theorist, but some of that might actually be going on. So that's another thing you can do is create confusion for your competitors.
Okay, wow. That was a fun example, going back, thinking of friction in that context. So you've also mentioned that friction, maybe it gets a bad rap. We probably think that right now in this audience. Are there spots where friction is good?
Oh, yeah.
Do you have examples of where maybe there should be more friction?
So if you think of the stuff that Catherine and I teach together, one of the things that we do with executives, and this is one of the classic things when they do design thinking, that they always want to rush ahead, like they get an idea and they just want to rush ahead and do it. We slow them down. We think about what we do when we teach design thinking. We force them to go out and to watch users, to come up with a whole bunch of ideas, to kill off almost all of them, and then to show them to users again when they develop them. So when it comes to innovation, that actually friction's a really good idea. The other time when it's good to have friction is, so there's the Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman, one of the two inventors of modern behavioral economics, along with Amos Tversky, who passed away. They have this notion that when you're in a cognitive minefield and things are all screwed up, you don't know what to do, in that case, you're supposed to slow down and actually figure out what's going on. So that's a second case. And then a third case, how many of you were ever in a fraternity or a sorority? Okay, well, so there's probably more of you, but anyway. Anybody in the military? Okay, so boot camp, fraternity and sorority, hazing. Who has assembled IKEA furniture? Okay, so the concept in all those cases, fraternity and sorority, hazing, military, assembling IKEA furniture, there's a bunch of research that shows, and this is sort of weaponizing, that the harder you work at something, the more valuable it is to you, regardless of its actual value. So there's these researchers, Dan Ariely's great researcher, has done a bunch of studies where he'll have people, they'll either assemble an IKEA box, or they'll be given an IKEA box, and how much would you pay for it? And it turns out when you assemble the IKEA box, people will pay about 50 or 60% more for the same crappy IKEA box, because you've done all that work. So I guess that's sort of weaponizing, but and we do this in the D.school. We just got done teaching the 6-day executive program. And especially, by the way, Catherine, who seems really nice, but she's like one of the main purveyors of this, Catherine is always thinking of ways, and Jeremy Utley and Perry Claymon, who we work with, to have our executives suffer as much as possible. We put them in embarrassing situations. We have them work really hard. We kind of abuse them for how crappy their prototypes are. And then we have them suffer. They like it even more. So that's some of the ways that friction is actually good.
I hadn't thought of all those things together, but friction creating value, whether you ascribe good value to it or some sort of value, right? Monetary, or even just kind of what I want to possess or how much value I would give that. And then learning experiences, I don't know, you and I haven't chatted about this before, but there is a lot of research showing that emotion connected with learning amplifies that learning. So if friction creates struggle, maybe,
right.
or grit, as a lot of recent research would talk about, then the value in feeling that friction can be advantageous to your learning and to how you remember things. I hadn't thought about it.
And when I think about what you're talking about, a lot of the situations, by the way, you and I design these all the time together, is we'll create situations that in the moment kind of suck for people, but then when they look back on them, because of the struggle, they seem like they're really great. Because that's what we always are creating situations where people fail constantly. Because the innovation process is almost all failure with an accidental success, and then they go back to failure.
Yeah, so you have to get really good at overcoming the friction of failure in that process.
Yeah.
And so not by our evil spirits, I don't think, but just out of a nature to want to recreate that experience so people can learn and struggle through it and continue to advance. A lot of our learning experiences do involve friction, and it's not feel good for a while. Let's see here. Okay, so people in the crowd, I get into Bob's research and I start thinking, kind of trying to self-assess. I think, oh no, am I a person that adds friction to other people's life, to other people's calendars? How many meetings did I book last week for other people? Anybody feeling that right now? Like, ooh, I'm not sure, maybe I'm creating friction in other people's lives. That's okay, a couple people. I think this is hard to do.
I think I sent out about 50 emails today, so I think that was a lot of friction.
That's fair. Other areas you might feel like, oh, I know where I'm lifting friction out of people's lives, or my employees, or my teammates. Can you talk a little bit about that? Are we good at self-assessing?
No, we're terrible. So if you look at research on self-awareness, and by the way, the place I know this best is when it comes to assholes, so maybe I'll talk a little about assholes. Okay. If you look at, in terms of self-awareness, we as human beings, especially if you have a reasonable self-esteem, we're actually terrible at understanding situations when, in general, as human beings, when we're doing bad things to other people or being ineffective. And we're actually much better at assessing it for other folks. I've got a colleague, Max Baserman, who teaches at the Harvard Business School, and he's done some research on home improvement projects. Has anybody ever done a home improvement project, sort of like a remodel? So it turns out that strangers are better at predicting how long your home improvement project is going to be, especially how late it's going to be, than you are. And just having been through one, my wife's sitting in the front row here, that they always take long and they're more stressful than you think. But if it's somebody else, you can just predict that it's going to happen. So to go back to people who add friction, or in the case of assholes who do add it. So there's research that shows that about 35 or 40% of Americans will work for or are working for an asshole boss. Somebody who leaves them consistently feeling demeaned, de-energized, disrespected. But then the same surveys show that about 0.5% of Americans think that they have been an asshole boss at some point in their life. So those numbers just don't add up.
I'm not a math person.
No, you're not. And so when you go to friction, what Huggy has this notion that when it comes to friction, the most useful thing is for all of us to try to be aware of when we're causing the problems, when we're perpetrators, when we're victims, and then the good part is rescuing people. So you know, and at least I think sometimes at Stanford, I'll have a poor student come in my office who's trapped in bureaucracy, and this is one of the other things, grease people and gunk people. There are some people at Stanford I know that I can send them to. There's a woman in my department named Lori Cottle, who's our student service head. I think, Andrew, one of my former students, is laughing. You've probably been saved by Lori Cottle before. So Lori Cottle is the person you send the students to, and she saves them from the Stanford bureaucracy, and she's just fabulous at it. But the key point is all of us are all three of those people. It isn't just that there's the good people who are us, we're the victims and the rescuers, but we all do this to one another unwittingly. So maybe I shouldn't have sent like 52 emails, including 3 to my wife today, for example.
Wow, okay, so we're horrible at self-assessing it.
Yeah, we're terrible.
Which is not a very energizing realization, right? So what are there cures? Are there ways of helping us assess or get assessment from the outside? Where have you seen somebody make a big change?
Well, so we're talking very individualistic. Let's switch to more organizational. So the class that I first met Catherine in, and we've been teaching together sort of off and on for a decade ever since, it's called D-leadership. And so Elizabeth Woodson and Saul Gardis, remember this?
Great story.
So what we do in this class is called D-leadership or design leadership. We take pairs of students, we put them in an organization. In fact, Catherine's going to be leading it next term. We did some emails about that today. And what they do is they help the organization become more innovative. And, I mean, just as an example of one of our favorite projects, there was a couple of students who helped the San Francisco Opera become more attractive to young people. If you have been to the San Francisco Opera, I'm 65, if I want to feel young, that's a place for me to go, because you get in line to the bathroom, and if you don't have a walker or a cane, you feel young. So anyway, but these students, they did a great job of making it more attractive. But in terms of friction, we had these two wonderful students, Saul Gardis, who is an executive at a company, and what company was he at? Citrix in those days. Now he's somewhere else. And a woman named Elizabeth Woodson, who was the Stanford undergraduate president. And they worked with an organization called the Golden Gate Regional Center. And the Golden Gate Regional Center provides services to disabled families and disabled people.
Yep, exactly.
And they had terrible silo friction problems where if you were going to sign up to get services from them for yourself, for your loved one, whatever, it would take 3 or 4 months. And we had our students, well, they these process maps, and the whole thing was, I'm waiting, I'm frustrated, I feel terrible, this is never gonna end, I hate myself. I mean, you literally, this horrible process. And the reason that there were so many problems was there was all these silos where people would pass from silo to silo. So Saul and Elizabeth, thanks to the money donated by Hasso Plattner, we're in an SAP building. Hasso is the primary shareholder. We have some money. So what they did was they rented a Winnebago. They put in 7 or 8 sort of bureaucrats, and they went into the community. And so 7 or 8 bureaucrats from different silos, and in 2 hours, they almost completed the process of signing up 9 people. And it took another week to finish it. So you took a 3-month process, and once you broke down the silos and dealt with the handoffs, they realized there was a problem. Now, just when you do a demonstration like this, it's not like instantly they could sign up people in 2 hours, but Saul, who's actually now on the board of GGRC, they work together, they have teams to help with the handoffs, and essentially last time I talked to him, which was about a year ago, he said the average sign-up takes about 2 months, and they've gotten rid of the really terrible experiences. But I mean, that was sort of like amazing.
Yeah, I guess my takeaway is listening to it now again is that organization couldn't see the friction or assess the friction and address it really easily themselves. They needed an outsider or to see it through the lens of the customer and be reconnected to that to see that it was truly a friction problem solving that had to happen. Because it had been existing like that for a long time.
And the tool, which I mean in the design school, you can find this stuff online. It's a journey map if you follow the customer journey through the process instead of looking at it from the perspective of each person in each silo. Sometimes it's more, you understand the problems. So well, you did a lot more work on that than I did, so I'm actually talking about your work, not mine.
It was a cool story. It was an innovative project, and it's less than 10% as long as that friction-ridden process used to be. Yeah, awesome. I know this time is going really fast for us. I wanted to get to ask a question. I know there's folks in the audience that aren't from big organizations. They're from pretty small organizations, or even maybe just starting their professional careers.
How many are in startups?
I think we've got like 10% of the audience, roughly. So, is friction a problem in small organizations? Is it just big organizations?
Oh yeah. So friction happens. If anybody has a family with more than one child, you probably are used to this. Or you have one child, that's enough. Yeah, I guess 0 to 1 is the real jump. So anyhow, but yes, it is a problem, and this is actually in our scaling book. A really good example is it's just about 9 years ago. I think one of the premier design school classes is called Launchpad, which is taught by our co-instructors now, Jeremy Utley and Perry Claiborne. And what happens in Launchpad, I should give some context, it's a really cool class. It's been taught, I just looked this up, for 7 years, I think. No, 2010 was the first year.
We're at 13 now. We're really
13? Wow.
We're pretty close. We're over 10.
We're over 10. So 2010, so this one was 2010. So there were 2 students whose last names I always forget, Ankit and Akshay, and they started a company that in their CS majors. So they designed an app, a news aggregator app, and in fact this was 2010, and this was when the iPad first came out. And some of us may remember that sort of across the street was the old Apple store, the little Apple store.
Yeah.
They literally waited in line and bought one of the first iPads, and they wrote one of the first apps, which they sold for $30 a piece. And so 2 students, they made like $300,000 in 8 weeks. It was just amazing. And there was a whole bunch of other dramas, but one of the points when we were talking to Ankit and Akshay about the growth of the company, they described to us that when they went from 3 of them, there was another founder too, to 8 people, they started having these communication and coordination problems. Because what they said is they tried to meet around the table with 8 people and they get in all these fights and have all this confusion. So then they broke into 3 little teams. And then once again, when they got to 12 or 13 people, they started having the same problems again. So what they did was they broke into small teams again, and then they added some process. And the process is sort of interesting because they were in a room, a building somewhere here in downtown Palo Alto. And what they would do is they'd have their 4 little teams working together. And then every afternoon at 3:30, each team, this is sort of like Scrum or Agile-like, would stand up and say, here's what I've been working on today. Here's my biggest problem. Can you help me? And if you think about it, so what are they doing? They're adding a little bit of process. They're breaking teams into smaller groups. And to me, that's sort of a warning that when things start getting too hard to do, usually it's a sign that maybe you need a little process. And if I was going to pick one thing that goes across a lot of the work Huggy and I have done, if you look at team size, it's one of the worst killers. So if you look at a team that has between, say, 3 or 4 people versus 11 people, reliably, and this is something that would be produced in the laboratory over and over again, what happens is that the average productivity of each person goes down. The reason is you spend more time coordinating and less time doing the work. And the other thing that happens is that interpersonal dynamics start degenerating. And the reason they start degenerating is it's sort of, think about the last time you went to dinner when you had 10 or 11 people at a table and tried to have one conversation. It's cognitively impossible. So you start having all those misunderstandings. So to me, I guess that's 2 kinds of friction, that it gets harder to get things done, and then you have interpersonal friction. But the difference between a 3-person and an 11-person startup doesn't seem very much, but it actually makes a huge difference.
Yeah. You hinted at some cures for friction. I want to get to some Q&A so folks get to have their questions up here with you too. Is team size one of the cures?
Team size,
hierarchy?
Having a subtraction mindset. Well, actually, hierarchy is complicated because if you are in a world, even though everybody talks about having hierarchy being a bad thing and having bureaucracy being a bad thing, it actually turns out and I just gave a more formal talk to a bunch of HR executives today, and they were talking about how when they're in organizations and it's not clear who has decision authority, it's terrible. Because what happens is that it's sort of like a Lord of the Flies situation or worse, because everybody's always jockeying over who has decision rights, and actually having it be clear of who has the final say in decision, and who has the right to have input, and who shouldn't be in the room at all. In that case, hierarchy actually helps you get rid of friction. And there's a bunch of research where psychologists and group dynamics folks have tried to create leaderless groups. They always are terrible till they get some sort of authority structure. So I hate to put in a good word for authority structure, and I hate when people tell me what to do, but still sometimes it's necessary.
Okay. I think with that, I don't want to steal so much of the time up
here.
Yeah,
let's
I
have some
get to sit
questions.
close to him, but you should get to sit close to him and ask questions too. Shall we open up to the audience? I see one over here.
We'd love to hear your question, and comments too.
You talked about the amount of time that people spend doing 360 evaluations and all that. I'd like to get your perspective on what is a good way to do performance management and performance reviews.
Oh, that's such an easy question. So what's the solution? So let's go back to the annual performance review. Many people in business are sort of a revolution against the annual performance review. And so there's 2 things that we know about performance evaluation. One is the way that the annual performance review is done in most organizations, which means that you have a bizarre conversation with your boss that you never have the rest of the year, and then you never have it again. So it actually turns out it's pretty clear that sucks, okay? But here's the problem, and Huggy Rao and I have actually been trying to figure this out with other organizations. The question is that what's better, and a lot of things that organizations are doing are even worse. So that's sort of the dilemma. But I think where the root of the answer is that when you have skilled enough managers that they have somehow or another have constant conversations and give constant feedback to the people they lead, that's actually skilled management. And in those organizations, the annual performance review isn't a surprise. And then some of you may know that Adobe got rid of annual performance reviews about 6 years ago. There's a woman named Donna Morris who's head of HR at Adobe, and they got rid of annual performance reviews. And at least she claims, we tried to get the evidence, but we did a case on them, but she claims that it's actually better. And she also claims that when they went to a system where leaders actually had to talk to the people on a regular basis, about 15% of them left the company or went back to being individual contributors. So it kind of got rid of the people who were lousy managers. So I guess that what I'm going to is I don't know what the best system is, but in sort of Donna's point that people actually talk to their people and are skilled at giving them feedback without making them feel terrible. If you have people like that in your organization, the system might not matter so much. So that's the best I can do. But if you're in the performance management space and you want the magic bullet that works for every organization, I don't think I can help you. And if somebody tries to sell you services and say they have solved this problem, I think they're lying to you.
I love the candid nature. I saw back here,
There's a
I
lot of
think
them.
you had your hand up next. Or whatever's close to the mic. I don't want to make you do calisthenics today.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for coming here. Question regarding vision as such, organizational vision overall. How do you align vision between various teams, be it development teams, product teams, business, leadership, other stakeholders, versus having the perception that the vision is aligned? And how do you measure it? Can you measure that you're aligned? Is the vision is aligned? How do you create?
Oh, God.
How do you
Okay,
create? How do you create alignment?
Questions first.
Easy question. First of all, there's some questions that are too hard. If you can answer that question, bless you.
I was just having this conversation earlier at work, so I figured, why not ask you?
The best I can do. So that question's too hard, and I can't answer it in detail. But the best I can do in terms of having people alignment, at least where Huggy and I start, and this is one of the messages in Scaling Up Excellence, is that we at least want in an organization for people to have agreement about what is good and bad behavior. And that at least those are table stakes. And in many organizations, there's not agreement about what's good and bad behavior. Our line is what is sacred and what's profane. And at least that I can answer. And when I look at organizations that are good at getting things done, you might not agree with what they do, and what they all agree on may be bad for them eventually. But one reason I believe that Facebook grew so quickly is the degree to which there was alignment that their culture was focused on move fast and break things. And in the early days, and actually through the IPO, and this is somewhere in our book, that they would do everything they can to brainwash engineers, to train them, to reward and punish them on their ability to move really fast and do all sorts of prototypes and stuff. And that was great until it wasn't. And I mean, other organizations that are good at this, Amazon, so I've done some talks at Amazon. If you ask people at Amazon, at least I did, what's sacred, what's taboo, they will say the customer. Mm-hmm. They really don't care about suppliers. If you're a supplier at Amazon, they really want to kick the shit out of you. And what's profane is wasting money. So I don't know, in terms of all the different ways to get alignment, it's hiring similar people, brainwashing the hell out of them, and sort of like getting rid of people who don't fit the mission. And then the other thing I guess I would add is that the best leaders tend to say a very few number of things over and over again and don't confuse people about what matters and what doesn't. But that's too hard. I'm just sort of ranting at you.
Yeah, thanks.
Mm-hmm. Hi, I did read Scaling Up Excellence a while ago.
Well, that was a long book, man. I don't think I've read it. Good for you.
But I
reread it.
I met Huggy at the time, and it was worthwhile. So what I'm curious about is when you're trying to grow a company quickly, and you want to avoid a lot of meetings, but you also want to scale up quickly and scale up that excellence quickly, how can you do that and not produce a lot of friction in the wrong places?
Yeah.
Well, so there's a guy named Chris Ye with Reid Hoffman wrote a book called Blitzscaling. So this is really his expertise and his argument. Their argument is that's what Silicon Valley is really good at. To me, when you look at organizations that scale quickly and do it well, I think Airbnb seems to be one that this actually applies to. That what they do is they just get to the point where they have, and this is this idea of sort of technical and organizational debt. They'll allow people to move really quickly and leave things sort of broken, but they know when to stop and fix things because they're too screwed up. And I guess a better point would be Waze. Waze, the navigation software that many of us use. That's an interesting case because they move really fast. They realized that nobody was using their software, and then they stopped for 60 days to see what was wrong, and then they started moving fast again. So the best I can say is you know when to hit the gas and hit the brakes, but you've got to be really careful. And Huggy and I did a case on Uber and technical and organizational debt at Uber, and Uber moved really, really fast for years. In addition to the bad behavior they had these really decentralized teams that did microservices, and it was great. Until it wasn't, it was absolutely terrible. So to me, I think of that founders and leaders are good at knowing when to push things and when to just stop things and to sort of conglomerate things together. But in real life, man, this is hard. Look how many startups that we're losing at a remarkable rate. And I guess if people took money from SoftBank, they should be really nervous. But you know, in life, it's hard.
So you talk about friction in teams. The Valley has changed so much from 30 years ago when it was American and teams were here locally in one location. Now the teams are multicultural,
right.
And now they're decentralized. And,
Yeah.
and so, you know, many times I wonder, you know, an American person might start with the point in the beginning of the conversation. A German person may have the point in the middle of the conversation. Right. You know, Middle Eastern person may have the point at the end of the conversation. Somebody may have no point in their conversation at all. As you see the friction between different teams, what do you do or what do you suggest around the different cultural aspects to help leverage the diversity and still have the creativity and the ideas come out?
So that's a really good question. And we probably all know this both intuitively and empirically. There's all sorts of research that shows that the more distributed your team is, and the more diverse it is in all sorts of ways, the more you've got to sort of work on this stuff. And so I actually give you an example of something that actually seems to work. So my co-author, Huggy Rao, with a woman named Lindy Greer, who's now at the University of Michigan, they've done a whole bunch of stuff with startup teams. And here's what they're finding. They're finding that in the first few days of the teams together, they've done randomized experiments and everything, that when teams do two things, they have a prenuptial agreement. In fact, the name of their paper is called Prenups for Startups. That's the name of their paper. and so essentially that's where they sort of negotiate the ground rules of how we're going to engage and what is sacred and what's profane. And then the pre-mortem part is, and this is classic Huggy, that every day they do a different analysis and the results change slightly, so you got to be careful. But last time I talked to him, which was 2 days ago, so this is the latest findings, it looks like if you do a pre-mortem, and a pre-mortem is you imagine it's a year from now, and you've been a giant success or a giant failure, what happened? It looks like if you do a prenup and a success pre-mortem, not a failure pre-mortem, that's the best thing you can do. So you lay down the ground rules, and you imagine that it's a year from now, and our team's been a great success. What did we do? And they're doing this with diverse teams, it seems to do. The other thing, to put it in a word for gender, and some of you may know this, look at, we've got, maybe we have 60% men and 40% women. There's some great research by a woman named Anita Woolley at MIT, and now she's at Carnegie, that shows that the more women you have on the team, the smarter the team is, controlling for IQ. And she's got some new unpublished research that shows that the optimal number of men on a team is 1. Andrew, I think I showed that stuff in class. This is unpublished research, but So that's the other thing you can do is just have as many women as possible. But I love you look at the curve, the number of women, it sort of looks like this, that one guy helps. It's slightly better than having all women. But kind of 3 women and 2 men is worse than having all women. Like, it's kind of scary. So anyways.
So kind of the coordination of the team, and then also setting goals towards what it is, the coordination being this prenuptial. There's a lot of, I say, kind of old school research on coordinating before collaboration, which seems kind of boring. I mean, shame me, that sounds boring. But turns out it's really important, and maybe it's more important as teams get more complex in the various ways that you mentioned.
And when they're distributed, to your point, Catherine, when they're distributed, when there's people all over the world and you're not looking them in the eye, having ground rules about what's good and bad behavior is especially important.
Yeah, that's a great point. Less social norms established through those daily bump-ins. Or feeling like someone's beside you or with you. We have one over here.
Hey, Bob. Good to see you again. I'm curious, in an effort to reduce friction, say, uninvite people from meetings, how do you deal with the potential fallout?
To uninvite people?
Yeah, because you're trying to reduce the friction in their lives.
Well, so this is the classic thing, and I don't know about you, but it's certainly this way at Stanford, that if you have a meeting and you don't invite people, everybody feels left out. So that's the sort of problem. There's this old book. So my wife's sitting in the front row, and her late father was provost at Berkeley for a decade, and he had this amazing book called Microcosmographia Academia, which is a guide for young academic politicians. And there's a line in there which is, a meeting is like a mousetrap. If you're in, you want to get, if you're out, you want to get in. If you're in, you want to get out. So there's that thing when you're not invited, you feel like you're unhappy. And to me, that's a case where if you have explicit norms and you have the discussion, that I think that it actually helps. And that's all that you can do. And the other thing, and since there's a lot of people in leadership roles here, I don't think there's such a thing as being a leader without hurting people's feelings a lot, because we're all sensitive creatures. And I think the good leaders know when to cool out people. And there's also just some people have thin skins and they're going to be hurt. And I'm not saying that you should hurt people's feelings on purpose, but just being human beings, that's just part of life. And to me, on average, it's better to have people's feelings hurt occasionally than to go to a bunch of crappy meetings with 20 people, only 6 of who really need to be there.
It's a great instinct, because it reminds me of the research. So it feels like you're saying, I'm not trying to uninvite you, I'm trying to save your time for you. And there's I think it's a curvilinear relationship with number of meetings and productivity. Is that right?
Oh yeah. So to that point, an anonymous firm, which is Microsoft.
Rhymes with Microsoft.
It rhymes with Microsoft. So there's a friend of mine, Jeff Polzer, who is at Harvard Business School, and he's got this amazing data set from this anonymous firm, Microsoft, because who else could it be? And just 200,000 organizations, and he's got email data, and he's got meetings data. And what his data show, it's a beautiful curvilinear relationship, which is that if you don't have enough meetings, your performance sucks, and if you have too many, your performance sucks. But the question we have for him is, how do you know when you're at the sweet spot? I don't know the answer to that. I'm not sure he does either. But it is a curvilinear relationship.
Hi there. You mentioned the IKEA effect. So basically, the harder you work at something, the more you value it. And my sense is that there's the stretch project, which is good, and then there's the masochistic culture, which is bad.
Right.
How do you find this sweet spot? And can you give me an example maybe of an organization that does this well? Hard question, I know.
I think that's too hard. I mean, the best you can do with that is when you have situations where good people it's a classic thing, where good people keep leaving, where they keep fighting. And then the other thing that I look for is when people start having health problems. But on the other hand, we all go through periods where there's sort of like the bursty period. It's not bad to have really intense periods where you work really hard and periods where you know when to slack off. So just Salesforce, I just went into San Francisco and back today. That's one of the things that I actually think that Salesforce does pretty well. And it isn't just the annual, that madness Dreamforce they have right now. At least in the engineering organization, they have it on this rhythm where every 4 months they ship. I think it's every 4 months. And the reason that helps is that everybody, all the Agile teams know that we're going to work really hard, we're going to ship, and then we're going to take a few days off. So I think that's a pretty good solution and this is one of the things that helps with friction, is you know when to put your foot on the gas and you know when to back off. It's one of the few reasons I think that universities actually still exist and still work, because we're all so badly ran. But the quarter system or the semester system, we all know when to work hard and we all know when to screw around. So the best I can do is to sort of have known rhythms.
I didn't tell Bob you can't talk about Salesforce in a positive light. That's our competitor.
I'm sorry.
Tisk.
Hi. So my question is, we talked that startups can handle friction because they are really small. But what happens when you scale up so much and there is a lot of friction? And how do you begin by settling it for big companies?
Well, first of all, so my friend Michael Deering, early stage venture capitalist, he's done everything from Harry's razors to masterclass, and he'll argue that the only real advantage that small companies have over big companies is speed. So there's lots of advantage to having big companies, but to me, what the best organizations do that are big is essentially that they kind of punish people who are bureaucrats and add all sorts of nasty stuff. And in some ways, that's the best that they can do. And it is interesting, and they're nasty companies in lots of ways, but one reason that I think that Walmart and Amazon are both so successful is they're actually remarkably impatient with people who screw things up and make things that are hard to do. So to me, that's a sign that it's actually possible. And they're both organizations that actually have to make money by selling stuff and doing it on relatively thin margin. And I think that's one of the things that adds the sort of discipline. But to me, it's one of those things that does get at the culture. And with Amazon and Walmart, you do have organizations that are pretty thin. And if anybody's ever dealt with Amazon and Walmart, they're so cheap. Both of them are. I think Amazon's even cheaper than Walmart. But that anybody who takes up an extra position who gets in the way, they get pushed out of the way really quickly. So that's the best that I can say, but it's generally a disease because as organizations get larger, you do need more hierarchy, you do need more process, and you do need more specialization, so you have more handoffs. So it's something that all big systems suffer from, but some are less bad than others. That's the best. It's
a great question because in a lot of organizations, I think you're really incentivized to add friction in a way, right? Like the more people that report to me, we can do some really simple math that would say you're incentivized to add friction, if not at least size, right? So, are there any incentives to remove friction that you know?
So I think that's one of the problems is most organizations have incentive to add them. So I'll give you an example of how to do it. My crazy co-author, Huggy Rao, he was in a hiring committee at Stanford, and he argued that the least qualified candidate should be hired. Because when he looked at the 3 people who were above the threshold, the other 2 had all this experience with big company politics and all these people reporting to them, and the other person had always just been an individual contributor. So he said, and at Stanford, to your point, at Stanford, the more people report to you, the more you get paid. So when you bring people who are good sort of fiefdom builders, they're going to figure out how to expand the people reporting to them. So Huggy said, let's hire the least qualified, least ambitious, still qualified person, because they won't add friction by adding a 30-person staff. So I'm not that creative, but that's an argument that the best person might not be the best person. The other thing about people who come and build an institution is they're more likely to leave too, because that's what they'll do. They'll build their resume and say, I built this 30-person team at Stanford, and then they'll go work in Silicon Valley for 3 times as much money. We lose people like that all the time.
This is a great nugget to chew on. I'm not sure I can fully process that right now, but we'll come later this evening. Next question.
Hi, Bob. The question is, I observed 2 different levels of frictions in mid and entry level jobs where a new person is trying to join a team and there are a bunch of old timers, so he or she sees some sort of friction.
Talk a little slower.
Okay. So 2 different type of frictions. An entry level person who's trying to join a company or a mid mid-managerial level person who's trying to join a company, and then there are a bunch of old-timers, and this person is trying to fit in, and then you look at another type of friction at the C level. So they have their trusted group of people. So when they move from one company to another, they take their whole team with them. And then there are couple of old people at executive level who are trying to fit in with a new group of people who have been sticking together for a very long time over their journey. And this is two different type of friction at two different levels in the organization, but they can both have adverse effect on the culture as well as people who are on the other side, like where you are in minority, whether you are an old-timer or like a group of new people coming together at the C-suite level, and then trying to make decisions with some handful of executives who are left at the company.
Okay, so that's kind of specific, so I'm going to answer a little bit more generally. So we're using friction in terms of making things harder to do, but there's another kind of friction you're sort of implying, which is basically conflict. And so conflict is actually really a good thing. And so we're talking about creativity. All the evidence is that the best teams fight like crazy in an atmosphere of mutual respect. And or at least moderate mutual respect. Sometimes, like some people get bruised a little bit in the process. So if you are having generational warfare among people who are doing so most of the time with mutual respect, and it leads to something better, then that's actually good. But if you're having conflict where people hate each other, and their main goal is to stab the person in the back, it's bad. And a good example of that is, and this is a company that we've worked with some, is at Pixar. So there was a point in Pixar's history, so this is fairly early on, they'd only made 3 movies, and they were worried that they were all getting along too well, and that there wasn't enough conflict. So they brought in a guy named Brad Bird. Brad Bird, the filmmaker from The Incredibles. And the reason that Steve Jobs and John Lasseter and Ed Catmull hired him is he was famous for getting fired for being difficult. And it's not like he was the kind of person who was difficult because he'd be nasty. He just couldn't stand mediocrity. And that's Brad Bird. So with the conflict stuff, although generational warfare is just one example, but when people are fighting because they have different points of view, or that's actually really functional as long as they both they know not to hurt people's feelings too much, and also they know when to stop. So another kind of bad conflict is after you make a decision and people keep fighting over it. But in the specifics, I don't know how to answer that, but the research on creativity is probably the most important hallmark of good creative teams, is they know when to fight and they know when to stop fighting, if I was to pick one thing. So we're talking about a creative place.
We have 2 more questions.
2 more questions. Yes. They're getting harder.
Hi, I was wondering if there's any structure that can be implemented to help people from forming into little clumps or cliques and doing like an us versus them within the organization instead of we.
So, well, first of all, this is a constant problem when people are in silos and we start being in tribes, we all start hating one another. It's one of the classic ways to get people to have dysfunctional conflict. And so that's an argument for sort of moving people around. It's also an argument for actually switching people's position. And one of my favorite stories on this is Ben Horowitz, Andreessen Horowitz. So he calls this the Freaky Friday technique, and he wrote a blog post about this. It's in his book. We first heard about it from him from years ago. He had 2 senior executives who were fighting like crazy, and he saw the movie Freaky Friday, if you remember that. It's with Jamie Lee Curtis and her teenage daughter, and something magical happened where they got to switch positions and see one another's perspective, and they got along better. So this inspired him to come in one day and tell them they had to switch positions. So that's that idea of sort of finding a way to sort of switch the role and seeing the other person's perspective. Another thing that we do with people who, and we do this in the D.school with, especially the school retool is one of these things that does it. When we have, you have school administrators who are really sort of hostile towards students, what we'll have them do, and this is our colleagues who run the K-12 initiative, that they'll have the principals in other schools shadow students for a couple days to see what it's actually like to be them. And I guess I'm just giving specific examples that in the D.school, we always, when we dislike somebody or don't understand somebody, we always try to find ways to get empathy for them. What else do we do to create empathy so that when you dislike someone,
it ties back to me from earlier in the evening where we realized that we're not really great at assessing ourselves what's of value that we contribute, and we're probably better at assessing what other people are doing poorly or advantageously for systems. It reminds me of the George Carlin quote, which I'm not sure I'm allowed to say out loud right now.
You can say it.
Like your stuff is shit and my shit is stuff, right? It's just that like, I value my stuff more than you would value it. But you can see outside.
I'm sure we can say shit. It's got to be okay.
But it meant to be a funny way to articulate that it's really hard to see that. And so by getting executives to switch roles and experience each other's processes, or by getting an admin or a principal or an instructor or professor to experience the student perspective is one of the best ways to kind of hack your way to that quick understanding, because we're psychologically positioned not to be able to get that very well. It's protective for us. It's kind of great in many instances, but when you're trying to make change, it's really hard.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I guess you're last.
Oh, wow. Okay. Thank you. This is really, really interesting. I come from a big corporation, but we don't have to say who that is. If there's such a thing as friction bullying.
Friction?
Friction bullying.
Uh-huh.
In the context of big organizational change, and I'm looking for some tactics, is there anything valuable, or is there something like friction shaming?
Friction shaming?
I know these are great words. So friction bullying is when I try to make it harder for you to do something by putting more friction in your way.
With intent.
Yes. And then the other thing, friction
shaming.
Shaming, what's that?
Well, I mean, it'd be interesting to hear what your thoughts. If I'm in a position to try to help enact organizational change, and based on hierarchy in companies, if I'm disproportionately influential, is there an opportunity or a tactic? And there's all sorts of political hierarchy stuff there, but I'm just trying to, as I listen to how you guys are describing it.
I love your lingo, but I'm not sure I can quite go there. But at least with senior executives, one of the things that I would start with, and we didn't talk about this, and our friend Perry Claiborne always talks about the cone of friction. So when you take senior executives, a lot of times they don't actually realize that they're unwittingly saying things or unwittingly making decisions. They're sort of just kind of thinking out loud, and then things get to happen. So they sometimes have blindness to the amount of overload. And one of my colleagues, Rob Cross, who studies collaborative overload, he finds that consistently senior executives overestimate by 50% the amount of load that they place on people. And one of the classic things that I've seen in a lot of the companies I've worked with is you'll have executives just make offhand comments, and they don't realize how closely people are watching them. So I don't know if this is shaming, it's just like blindness. And just to give you a stupid one, there was a company that I worked with some years ago, and a new CEO went to a meeting and asked where the blueberry muffins were. He just said, "Oh, is there any blueberry muffins?" From then on, everywhere he went for 5 years, there was zillions of blueberry muffins because and to me, that's that sort of magnification. The other thing I would add, and I'm not sure it's shaming, but if there's somebody in your organization, just to sort of follow this, who has low prestige but has a lot of influence, that's one of the most reliable ways to turn somebody into a bullying, petty tyrant. If you think of the DMV, if you put somebody in a position where they're not respected, but they have some influence over people, that's when they'll start taking it out of people. So if you have somebody like that in your life, if you can't get rid of them, I guess there's an argument for treating them with more love because it just might work. So that's loving the friction person, not bullying them. If not, then maybe you might bully them.
So I'm chewing on these phrases. I kind of think they're fun to think about.
Yeah, they are fun to think about.
And friction shaming, to me, could be done pretty powerfully when it's through the friction given to the customer. right? I think that's one where anybody in an organization would have to defer what's best for the customer in that situation. So I think of the Golden Gate Regional Center.
Yeah.
It's 3 months long. I know some work being done in social services in the state of Michigan, in Detroit, where they're looking at the literally like miles of paperwork that has to be done for any given service and shaming that friction, right? Of course, in some ways that's connected to someone's role or job or what they've created. But when you shame it because it's creating this experience for our customer, that might be one way to get around some of the bad feelings associated with shaming. But I'm going to chew on that for a while. I think it's kind of interesting.
So following your point, Catherine, I don't think it's unreasonable to start when it's happening to assume that the people are doing it don't realize it, or maybe they're not getting enough love. And sometimes stronger measures are necessary, but those aren't bad places to start with empathy and love. And that's very D.schoolish.
Yeah. Great. That's a good end note. I had a last question, but I think that was a good one.
Yes, I could listen to you guys talk all night. Thank you guys so much for the questions. Thank you guys for being here. A special shout out to the University of Nebraska, Omaha, that came this evening. Thank you guys for being here. Thank you guys all for being here. We're not having a speaker series next month, but in January we're going to have Frederick Furt, who is the innovation for Google. It's going to be a really, really good conversation on January 22nd. Please follow the HanaHaus for a lot of our speaker series that are upcoming. Round of applause for Bob and Catherine. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you all.